Hello and welcome to Tuesday Talks at Mary Spring Nature Center for 2026. My name is John Fromer, the Program Director and your host. Today's Tuesday Talk is generously sponsored by Camden River House. Recordings are made possible by the Cascade Foundation. You can find today's talk and previous talks on our YouTube channel. Mary Spring is open every day of the year from dawn to dusk free of charge. Find out more at maryspring.org. Today's program was recorded on March 31st, 2026, entitled Next Level of the Food Recovery Hierarchy, presented by Dr. Susanne Lee of the Senator George J. Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions.
The invitation back to Mary Spring to meet with your group and to talk to you about the issue of wasted food in the state of Maine. I want to just make a little bit of a bridge with my background. So I was at the Maine Business School, but because of the great interest both by students and myself in sustainability solutions, I started working with the Mitchell Center on the issue of wasted food, and I became so involved in the students. Mitchell Center is a research center. It doesn't actually teach classes, but what we do have is we have interns. So it allows us to work more closely with individual students on projects. So I've now switched over to that. So the work that you will see today is really all the work that I've done for the past 6 years since I moved over to the Mitchell Center. And all of that work is in concert with a team. We at the Mitchell Center work on transdisciplinary team building. So we think problems like wasted food require not just one type of expertise, but actually require a lot of different expertise applied to solve it. And we always work with students. And the last sort of defining part of our work is it's all stakeholder engaged research. So unlike a lot of parts of the university, where the research is for the purpose of publishing in academic journals, we only take on projects at the Mitchell Center that come at the request of some community or the state. We work a lot with the DEP. So anyway, so that's the background. And I would also say before I start, well, first of all, I can only see my presentation, so I can't see all of you, but I welcome you to ask any questions at any point. I'm happy to stop and address any questions. So I think John volunteered to help with that. So anyway, with that, I will get started. And again, I said I have been here before and I talked about the problem of wasted food, and I talked about the solutions that we were working on at the Mitchell Center in terms of our research. But in coming back today, I wanted to really, and in thinking about Mary Spring as a nature center and the types of really engaged programming you have, I wanted to take a slightly different approach today and talk about how really at the core, the issue of wasted food as a problem, which I will go over that, is that people seem to have forgotten that food is a resource. And so even the subtitle is Rethinking Wasted Food in Maine to Save Money, Feed People, and Protect the Land. But it's actually more about remembering that food is a resource that needs to be managed and never wasted, and that food at every level still has a higher purpose than going into the trash, the landfill, or being incinerated, or for that matter, going down the drain. All of those are non-food disposal resources that should never be used. So the presentation today is all going to really focus more on that, how to think about the food resource that we're producing in our state and how we should utilize it fully, the food resources that you're bringing into your home and how to utilize that more fully. And then we wouldn't even have a waste problem. So, and the visuals that I put up on the screen now really are meant to show that, that at the stage in the fields, we definitely know that that's broccoli and that's good edible food. It goes, for example, into our schools to be eaten by students. But sometimes there's that food, the broccoli, for example, doesn't get eaten. And so it might have to be saved as a leftover and, presented another day as soup. Or, in the schools and in our communities, we have ways to share and donate good edible food that we're not going to eat. But what I think people forget is that even if it's not edible by us, it could be edible by animals. And so the Home Depot bucket shows what we've been picking up as scrap from a local restaurant and then feeding it to the cows, who are delighted. They don't consider that waste. They consider that a delicacy, and they eat it. And even at the point at which it's not edible by people or animals, the picture, kind of going clockwise, it's compost, which is meant to feed the soil. And so I sort of close with the picture of the tractor and the manure spreader, or the compost that we use to spread compost on the fields that fertilize the fields so that it can grow more. So it's kind of a visual representation of, at every level, we have 361,000 tons of food that's lost or wasted in our state annually. The majority could be eaten, so it's good and edible, and it fits up at the top of the screen. But at every stage here, food still has nutrients and energy that can be used to nourish either us or the animals or the soil, and should never be wasted. So that's the little opener. So I'll take you through, though, the traditional problem, just in case anybody's not fully aware of the issue of wasted food. So a third of the food that we produce in the world, in our country, and in our state, about a third, somewhere 30 to 40% of the food produced is actually never eaten. So in the United States, 133 billion pounds of food wasted annually, worth more than $160 billion. And I'm sure with today's rising food values, and prices, it's even more than that. What people often forget about they know about food ending up in the trash and that, but what they don't think about is the additional waste of the resources that go into producing food that's never eaten. So the fresh water that we use, and about, I think, a quarter of the freshwater supply is used for food that actually never gets eaten. The energy that is used to produce and transport food that never gets eaten, the soil that we deplete to produce food that never gets eaten, and then the labor. With that rising cost also, we use all this labor to produce food that never gets eaten. And then if that's not bad enough, we then have to pay for the disposal of that food that we're wasting, which is always the heaviest, the most costly part of our municipal solid waste stream, because it's heavy and wet, and actually it does comprise the largest piece of municipal solid waste. 97% of wasted food also ends up in the landfills, where, because landfills were created not to have wet foods, they were conceived of as a place for dry trash. Nobody thought that food would end up in a landfill. So it's now, when food does end up in the landfill, it produces methane gas, a greenhouse gas. This slide needs to be updated. 25 times worse than CO2. It's actually 80 times worse in terms of fueling climate change. So just a couple of points here in Maine, definitely about 40% of our food, the 361,000 tons that I mentioned, it's the single largest part of our solid waste stream, food. So if you picked through the landfill, the thing you would find most often, and sadly, is food. At the same time, Maine leads New England in food insecurity, with 1 in 7 adults and 1 in 5 children going hungry. And yet, this food ends up in the landfills, wasting money, harming the environment, and removing nutrients. That which ends up in landfill is removed forever from the food system, as opposed to that picture on the cover I showed you, which is a more circular system, where actually the last nutrients left in the food gets composted, which goes back into enriching the soil. Just a few more wasted food facts. The average US family throws out about $3,000 a year worth of food. And, with everybody focused on the cost of food and, budgets being strained, we would like to think that this would make people focus on wasted food, but it's become such a pervasive habit that it seems that even the cost of food is not really slowing down the waste. Refed, in terms of, you might want to think about, well, where is all this food? Oh, it must be grocery stores or restaurants where all this food is being wasted. But actually, the majority of wasted food occurs in the households. Confusing food date labeling. I think you're all familiar with those dates that are printed on almost every food product in your home. That Best By labeling and confusion about it, people think that it's a health and safety thing, and many people organize their cupboards or their refrigerators and throw out everything past the date, which is actually a serious problem because it's about $1.8 billion a year of food, perfectly good and edible food, that's thrown away mistakenly. The only food where date labeling is really an issue is baby formula and raw meats and seafoods and that kind of thing. But you know that there's dates on everything else. And the sad misunderstanding is that those are just set by the manufacturer and not based on anything having to do with health or safety. The majority, and so resultingly, the majority of this wasted food is good and edible, can be eaten by people types of foods. Also, sadly, the fruits and vegetables are often the largest part of household food waste because, people don't know how to store them properly. And so it's sad because fruits and vegetables are so expensive, and it's the most nutritious part of what we buy to feed ourselves. And so the fact that it gets thrown away so often is a problem. And just another fact to realize that the surplus food from retail and consumers is sufficient to feed a far greater number than estimated by the USDA to be food insecure. We talk about it on a global scale that we actually produce on there 2.5 times more food than we would need to feed everybody on the planet. But that doesn't happen, and there is a lot of waste. Just to go through, so that's kind of the framing up the problem, the impact of this problem. Like I said, it's a lot of waste of money. 1.8 billion is the retail value of that food lost and wasted here. The higher prices increase the value of that wasted food, and again, we should see it slowing down because of that, but it hasn't shown that yet. Higher labor costs also increase. So because we pay people a lot more to produce this food that we waste, that's another huge impact. If you pay attention to your municipal budgets and where your property tax is going, the municipal solid waste costs are going up because those disposal costs are going up, both the hauling with gas prices, what they are, and then putting it in the landfill. We have very little landfill capacity left in our state. So what is there? They are charging higher prices for tipping waste into the landfill. So that disposal cost is going up. And so you can see that the economics of wasted food are really a problem. The social impact, again, talking about the high level of food insecurity in our state. We also have, food as medicine is a growing sort of awareness that, nutrition from food is essential for health and therefore shouldn't be wasted. And the majority of wasted food happens in developed countries like the US. So it's actually a bigger problem here in the United States and impacting our society. The environmental impact, Project Drawdown lists food waste reduction as the #1 impact climate action that households and individuals can take. So working on that, 90% of food waste goes to landfills, where I told you produces methane. If food waste were a country, it would be the 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter after the US and China. So again, if we could end the wasted food, it would be a tremendously positive impact on greenhouse gas production. And the climate impact of food waste is equal to driving 50 million cars for a year, greater than the airline industry. To think about it more locally, this wasted food going into the landfills, threatens both the water and air quality, because what happens in the landfill, again, as I said, it's not made to hold wet food. And so what they call garbage juice, leachate, actually comes out of those landfills and then can seep into nearby waterways, polluting the water. And wasted food often also gets incinerated. We have waste to energy facilities in our state. And so that food waste getting into incineration impacts the air quality. So it's an environmental problem. So hopefully, and if you have any questions about it, I've tried to show you that it is a big problem. It has a number of, negative impacts for our state, and that we need a solution now. Because, this wasted food problem unlike other things where only, maybe sectors of our state are impacted, wasted food, this problem impacts everyone. National and state goals are looking at requiring 50% reduction by 2030. I'm not sure if you're aware, but recently the legislature passed LD 1065, which will start in 2030 restricting food from going to the landfill by the largest food generators. So it won't necessarily impact households in 2030, but it will start with the largest wasted food generators, food production facilities and things like that. Our climate action plan also recognized the importance of ending wasted food because of that impact on the environment. So the 2024 update sets that same goal of 50% reduction by 2030, which, is not that far away since we're in 2026 now. And, but the good news is that simple solutions, and like I said at the very beginning, even just changing our mindset is really a very powerful solution, and that you can make a difference. So I'm going to take you through now some of the ways of maybe changing the thinking about food to sort of act as a solution for this wasted food. So the first most important thing in terms of a solution is to understand that there is as food as a resource, there's a hierarchy of what to do to reduce wasted food. And basically it's the idea that is very, I would say more traditional. It's our culture here in Maine. It's how we always believed in the state, which is the food that we produce should be put to its best and highest use. So, and that's my pictures sort of show this best and highest use. Again, I have the broccoli example since we're one of the largest producers of broccoli here in our state. So I thought it's a good example, but, we produce it here, and therefore, we should, first of all, make use of it. So, if you're going to buy it, use what you buy only what you need. And, we should make sure we have gleaning initiatives and things to make sure that all that broccoli that we do produce gets utilized, number one, at the top of the pyramid, to feed people. So that is the best and highest use. If you produce the food, it should be eaten. And, using leftovers and all the rest. Now, if it doesn't get eaten by people, maybe you missed that stage. So now it's not really good for people. As I said, you could see with the farmer there, it's good for the animals and they're happy to take it. And then if not for the animals, if it's now not, for whatever reason, not good for people or the animals, it's really good for the soil, again, the nutrients and energy. So that pyramid that's shown there is actually the Maine wasted food hierarchy. So if you just keep that in your mind, best and highest use, first of all, reduce, try not to overproduce the food, only what you need, then feed people with it, then feed animals, and then if you can compost the rest to feed the soil, you literally have become a zero food waste household or state or country. These are the solutions that we work on in our research, but I would say, again, the simplest way to think about it is we do all these solutions to try to help people to channel food according to that hierarchy. So tracking and measuring the amount of wasted food helps you be mindful and have a good idea of where that food is going to go. Food rescue system makes sure that all the food actually tries to go to feed people. Education is what I'm doing today, which is really necessary for people to change their thinking about food. Maine's food processing infrastructure is another solution. If we could use the broccoli and freeze it or put it into prepared frozen foods or something, can it or whatever, we can then save even more of that food to be eaten by people. Food donation is an important one, again, to get food to people. And then solution 6 is, okay, like I said, if we didn't get it to people and we didn't get it to animals, then we should definitely have the ability throughout our state to divert wasted food into composting so that we can prevent it from going to the landfill. So some of the work that we've done with our teams is, and I've kind of redone these slides to show sort of how we have just used food to its best and highest use. So we did a tracking study with the Department of Corrections. We actually did all 5 major facilities and they're very good about not wasting any food, but they were really interested still in having us come for 9 weeks and track what was getting thrown away. And if you can see that little graphic, that's how we were tracking. So how much, the reason that it was getting thrown away, and then importantly, the destination. So what was happening? Did that food that wasn't getting eaten, was that going in the refrigerator to be used for leftovers? Was that going to be put into the compost, or was it going to be donated to a food pantry? So you can basically do the same kind of tracking at home, to try to, manage your food resource. What we found with the Department of Corrections was the only thing that they were sort of missing is that they had a problem with the production of daily food according to a menu, because the menu didn't have any opportunity. If you have a Monday menu, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and you don't have any way to reuse what might be left over because you have a totally new menu. Now, imagine in your household, it's the same thing. If you plan to have a new meal every day, what is supposed to happen with your leftovers? So this simple switch, and that's what the visuals are meant to show, is that they started saving their leftovers because there was always a slot in the next day's menu for somehow repurposing the food that would be left over. So if it was rice, it could be fried rice. If it was, some vegetables, they might be cooked into, burritos or whatever it is. So, again, these pilots that we've done with businesses or institutions can actually also be replicated at home. And so, again, they were utilizing their food resource. In the end, the Department of Corrections does compost. So they could say, well, it doesn't really matter, right? Because we don't really throw it in the landfill, we put it into the compost. But what I'm talking about today is to think about the best and highest use. So if not just throwing this good edible food into compost, but actually remaking it into the next day's meal to feed people is a better use, saves you, think about the money versus every day you make a new meal. Every day you have to shop for every day. If you can actually take your leftovers and make that be the next day's meal, you could almost cut your food bill in half. So that's the work. And we've done the same kind of tracking study with Northern Light Health at a couple of their big hospitals. And again, that same chart, like I said, you could use this at home. What is getting wasted, how much, and why is it getting wasted? And what was the destination? So you could see something like this as simple as bread. And the reason for the loss was, it got stale. And so maybe in the past times they might have thrown that, put it down the garbage disposal or something like that. But really what they realized, like they could make croutons out of the bread. Or I show a picture there, there's a lot of overproduction. There was a lot of overproduction in the hospital, and they would think that they could put that down the garbage disposal, because it would make it disappear. But what we helped them realize is that all that food is good and edible, and that Manna Food Bank, and they did set up this program themselves, would be happy to take that good and edible food. So at the end of the day, they just would put those into trays that the food pantry, the food bank could pick up and make use of it again to feed people, which was a much better use. Like I said, we not only is it an idea that this could be done in the household, we did actually January, a couple of years ago, we did a household tracking where we had people simply just separate their food waste from their regular trash if they were using one bin for everything. Just for a week, we asked them to set it aside and see what was getting wasted and try to help them think of new uses, other things that could be done with those food scraps instead of throwing them away. Some of the tips that we shared with them through this tracking study was, basically if you could plan better, you can waste less. So planning means shopping your fridge first, very often people go to the grocery store, they think they need something because they didn't actually check the pantry. Now they've ended up with too much. Now something goes bad and has to be thrown away. The other thing that happens is, you should shop with a list, because otherwise you go into the store and you get captivated by different things there, and you end up with more food than you can possibly eat that week, or things that are perishable. And so that's a problem. And then also, it's hard for people, to always figure out exactly how much food that they should be making for their family, or especially if they're having a party. So some resources I put in green there just so you could see that, the idea of shopping your fridge first, Big Oven and Super Cook give you ideas of what to make. If you just put the ingredients that you have sitting in your refrigerator, they will give you different recipe ideas. Shopping with a list, Plan to Eat, and Meal Board both can take your weekly meal plan and actually make it into a shopping list for you to keep you focused. And that there are also quite a few apps that help you plan. If you tell them how many people you're having and what you're serving, they will tell you how much you need of the different ingredients, how many pounds of chicken to feed that amount of people. So there's a lot of planning apps to help you waste less. Same thing for storage. Again, I talked about fruits and vegetables, and a reason why so many fruits and vegetables, especially berries, I mean, we all know, right, buying those raspberries almost the first day you put them in the refrigerator, some of them start to mold. So there is a Food Keeper app that actually is super good to tell you. You can look up for every type of fruit or vegetable, or actually a range of foods, what the best way to store those and keep those for the long term. If that fails, the freezer is your friend. Right now, my freezer is at capacity just because we do often use it when we know something's not going to last much longer, that we can put it into the freezer and be able to keep it to be good and used on another day. Definitely, one thing about storing better is don't pay attention to the best by and use by date labels. The UK, where they've made the biggest inroads against in terms of ending wasted food, they actually decided to take those dates off all the food products and tell their people to use their senses again, sniff, smell, taste, like we used to do, to see if something's good or not good. Cook creatively. Like I said, there are websites to help you figure out how to use whatever you have. IKEA, interestingly, has a free download, a whole cookbook of ways to use up leftovers, or, things that you have in surplus. And then there's a lot of creative things. A lot of people in these talks often say to me, well, but what about orange peels and these things? Like, you can't eat those. There's nothing you can cook with them. But there are other uses. So orange rinds can be used in potpourri. Coffee grinds, the coffee grounds, can go into your garden for plants that like that. Hard cheese rinds, sometimes, I know when I went to France, I saw that this is what they were using for chew sticks for their dogs. Planting onion ends and scallion tops in water. So there are a lot of creative uses. And like I said, with composting as the ultimate use of the nutrients, if all else fails, that will be a way to not have wasted food. So that's what we do in terms of tracking and measuring to sort of help better reduce the waste. We also have done a lot of pilot work on trying to increase food rescue. So again, food that didn't get eaten the first time by people. So now the thought might be that it now just goes into the trash. So an example was at UNE in their student cafeteria. The students came and actually worked with us at the Mitchell Center because they were concerned that so much food was getting thrown out after a meal. So they actually put together a food rescue program where they would take trays of good and edible food and wrap them up. And the students had a drop-off service where they would bring it to the local food pantry. So picture one shows, the perfectly nice food in the cafeteria. And then, it got brought over to the food pantry where it could then be repurposed into meals that they were producing. So, the rescue growth, you go from zero, all of this was going into the trash, into the landfill, and all of a sudden it was kept as good and viable food for people. Some other different programs that we've developed to do this. Community suppers are an excellent way of repurposing a community's food surplus. So surplus from sometimes hospitals are clearing out their freezers, sometimes restaurants and grocery stores have a lot of surplus, and it's not always things that can be given out at the pantry. So it makes perfect resources to use for community suppers. And so we did some of those in Machias. The community fridge that we started at Orono, all the food that it's the student union. They make sandwiches and all sorts of things, grab and go type foods, but it doesn't always get sold that day. So our food service provider, Sodexo, was happy to work with our students to have a free community fridge. So food that didn't get sold can actually be given away free through that community fridge that's at the student union downstairs. And on a broader community basis, there are these things called fridges, and I just show an example there of where community residents can actually donate good edible food, sometimes shelf stable. You see they have a pantry set up and a refrigerated setup if you have a group that's willing to manage that. But the nice thing about that, and also our community fridge at UMaine, is that it's a 24/7, and it's also sort of stigma free. Nobody's watching, nobody's asking really, this is surplus that needs to be eaten. So nobody's asking like, are you really hungry enough? Do you have to have this? No, if you're going to make use of the food, please take it, because otherwise it would go to waste. Some other efforts to sort of increase food rescue. I was taking a picture because I'm quite fond of it. Actually, at the grocery store I shop, they have these carts where they mark down on any produce that, is kind of doesn't look quite as beautiful as the produce that is in the shelves and on display. They put it into bags and they mark it down. So, this might not be, stuff that you would eat in a salad or things, but you certainly could chop it up and put it into any sort of a cooked casserole or things like that, and at a substantial discount. And we really like this, donation is really good and giving, but when a grocery store does this kind of markdown, it saves a lot of transportation and labor costs. Like nobody has to come and pick it up and drive it somewhere else. It just goes from that display into a bag and on this rack. And it allows, all sorts of their customers, some who might have less money, who don't want to go to the food pantry, but who have, a real option here to get good, healthy food that just might not be as pretty, but it's at a real substantial discount. And they even do that with meat. And I took a picture of these chickens because the manager's special are sold at $1.99 for these fancy prepared, stuffed pork, stuffed chicken breasts. The regular item is being offered on the top for $7.99 a pound. So again, the grocery store says, look, it's almost going to be past date, so we know we need to get rid of it. So we're going to mark it all the way from $7.99. It's being sold for $1.99 a pound. People can eat really well, and it prevents that from being wasted. I told you, we actually found that our restaurant that we go to frequently had a lot of food scraps, and so now we gave them buckets and they collect the food scraps, and then we pick them up and they're fed to the cows. So there's just, again, if you think about the food that you bring into your house as a resource, the food that you bring into your grocery store, if you have a food business, your restaurant, it's a very valuable resource, and just part of the management has to be how to get the best and highest use out of everything. Another thing that we work on, like today, is a lot of wasted food education. We have done signage for communities. So in Waterville, we did this where they have a community composting bin, what should go in. And for sure, we advocate for all composting, that nothing but food. It's all, the name of my talk, it's all food. That's all that should go in there. Compostables are not food. Shouldn't go in there. Papers are not food, should not go in there. There should be nothing but food. That's what has the nutrients and energy, and that's what should be composted. And once you start entering in those other items that are not food is when you have the potential for contamination, as we've seen PFAS and things getting into, then land applied, and now you have a big problem. So if we can just compost and recycle only food, then we can keep it, things clean and healthy for us all. So we do signage, we do composting workshops, and all sorts of, like here at Mary Spring today, to help people understand what the right thing is. One big initiative that we have going on throughout the state is school wasted food education, primarily focused on elementary schools. And, if you look on the left, I brought the poster because I thought it'd be kind of good. I talked to you about the importance, all of this work falls in line with the hierarchy. Well, we even developed a kids version that's a poster in the cafeteria, that reminds them the very first thing you should do is, make less food, don't put too much food on your plate if you're not going to eat it. And so just be thoughtful about that. And if you don't eat it, then the second picture shows the share basket, and that's what it says, share with other people. So the share baskets are in the cafeteria for the packaged, food that's safe, hasn't been touched, and that student is not going to eat it. They know they're not going to eat it. They are told and instructed to share it with others. And then we have a setup. I put the signs up there, the 5 signs. They have we call it a sorting station. So when they're done with their meal, they know to put the silverware first, then they pour off the liquids, then they take all the paper trash, and the last thing that's left on their tray is just the food. And so they understand that the food is a resource and can actually, so some of our programs actually, farmers do pick up the food scrap bin and it goes to feed pigs. And I would say, probably the majority, though, use those food scraps for composting. So students, we're trying to get them to learn today that we believe that food is an important resource. It should not be thrown in the trash. It should definitely be captured separately. You can use it to compost and do a school garden. You can use it for compost at local farms, or if you're lucky enough to have a relationship with a farmer, it can actually go to feed animals. And so that's the school program. We have the older kids wear these little vests, Food Rescue Hero, because they are really helping their peers to learn about the program. And so you could all be food rescue heroes in your own home by following the same practice. Trash and food should never go in the same place. Food is never trash. Some other education that we have is social media. So, I think that John is going to give you my contact information, but we have a website, which is right there, the Food Rescue Maine website. And we have links to our social media, which there is actually a series called Leftover Makeovers. And it's all sorts of ideas for reusing leftovers and bringing them back to life. And, things I never even knew, like if you have those like sort of wilty carrots that have been in your refrigerator too long and they kind of get bendable. I didn't know that you could actually put them in chilled ice water and that it would actually make them return them to like normal carrot status. And so there's just a lot of really great tips for things that people think there might otherwise be no use for. So we have that TikTok, that's actually even better. Well, I mean, I think it is, because it's all these food ideas. So how to use any odd things like those stale crackers. I think one of the students did, if you have stale crackers, stale bread, you can grind it up, make it into a breadcrumb, and then you can like use it to make your homemade chicken nuggets with that. So, or potato pancakes out of leftover mashed potatoes. So these are like really students, things that they thought would be really fun that they could make out of leftovers that they commonly had. So you can check that out. Solution 4, another area which relates to home and it relates to businesses, and probably the state, is that we need to think about more food processing. So to get the full and best value out of food, sometimes it does take a little bit extra work, but it can really save you money. Again, if you go to the little bit of extra effort to reuse those leftovers, it could save you the money of having to go out and buy food for another day's meal. So I put in here Maine Grains because they practice this at their, as a business. All of the byproducts of the grain milling they used to have to sweep up and then have it put into the dumpster and carted away. But with a little bit of extra effort, they realized that if the milling byproducts could actually be used for animal feed. And so now they are a zero waste facility, because everything that they produce, every byproduct of their actual milling process, they have made it into either a product line, or in the end they compost it. So there's no waste going on. Similarly, Bristol Seafoods, they talk about 100% fish utilization. Nothing goes to waste. So while they produce haddock fillets, they also, any scraps they use for the pet food industry. And so they, chunks that aren't perfect for fillets, they sell that as chowder fish. So, it's really a great practice. These are businesses that do it, and there are economic benefits for them. The same thing, though, could happen in your home kitchen. And then we have so much brewing going on in our state, and the spent grains that are a byproduct of brewing. So, the brewer doesn't really need it for anything. They're making the beer and they're selling the beer. But those spent grains are full of nutrients, and they are terrific to be added to animal feed or as part of animal feed. They also, other states and where they have a lot of beer production have started actually making them into breads and crackers. Spent grains can have a whole second life as a grain-based food product. So, and then so that's kind of the business side of it. And then the right-hand side of the slide shows what you can do at home. So a soup pot is a perfect place for any sorts of leftovers that you have, or byproducts. You made a dinner with some carrots, but you had a couple left over. I mean, I think that pot, there is a bunch of things left over from a bunch of other meals, all going into one pot. Then the next slide is applesauce. We have such a bounty of apples, but you go and buy applesauce, but you can actually pretty simply make your own, taste better, makes use of a lot of apples that aren't beautiful, but very delicious. And then the bottom is what I talked about, this breadcrumb thing. That is a product that, people sort of have as a pantry staple, but in my household, we don't ever have to buy it anymore, because we have, unfortunately, always so many leftover crackers, chips. It's even a good use for those horrible, Cheetos, those flaming hot Cheetos. But once you mix them in with some crackers or things, they're not flaming hot, and they just make a good coating for some, maybe coat your fish or something. So anyway, there's just a lot of upcycling that you can prevent waste that way. Of course, donating food, when you have food donation bins, this is obviously a very good area and good use of food that you're not going to be using. And then finally, I think this is what John said that you guys are working on, is community food composting, or your own composting. And the idea is that, again, try your best to get food to be used as its best and highest use. But in the end, it's still a terrific use of those food scraps that are inedible to be made into compost. For one, just to enrich the soil, which is so important to be producing new food. So that's important. But we actually have communities who are doing this collection of food scraps, making their own compost, and then actually having a good enough pile that they can charge, if they choose, they can actually sell the compost. So there can be an economic return from that, in addition to the better use of the food resource. So, I guess the next steps are really just to have you think about this, maybe do some tracking and measuring in your own home, very simply, just to see what is currently getting wasted. And if you could rethink about that, food that you're not otherwise utilizing, to make sure that it just doesn't go into the trash. You have a lot of wasted food education that's available through our website and through our social media. And then, maybe just taking action to reduce, recover, and recycle, and remembering that it's all food. I think, if you can just look at it and remember that it is food and never view that resource as trash, that will go a long way. And I put this in here because I saw this challenge that had just some interesting ideas, and I thought I could leave you with these, maybe challenge you to, eat leftovers freeze good food to prevent it from going bad. Rethink about your food date labels. Like I said, crackers are not going to be a health risk if it's a day late. Creating a flexible meal planning routine, just like we learned with the Department of Corrections, that, if you have this inflexible schedule, you don't have time to use up leftovers. So, give yourself a little flexibility. Keep your, I have that section of my refrigerator I learned somewhere along the way, eat this first. And so things that and you want your family to know that these things need to be eaten before you go eat the new ones, that can help a lot. And, spreading awareness maybe about this talk. So that is really what I would like to leave you with. So.
That was a wonderful talk. Thank you, Susanne, very much.
Well, I hope something resonated.
Let's see. Questions can be put in the chat. Have you done a cost-benefit analysis of the school cafeteria programs, including the cost of paper, plastic containers, and labor to transport food waste to shelters?
Yes, we have a whole school cafeteria study that we've done over 2 years. It's on the Food Rescue Maine website, so all the details, but that was definitely part of it. We did tracking and measuring of the waste. Then, and with the interventions that we did, how much were we able to reduce the waste, which was over the 9 weeks, average of like 20%. A big effort. We had 2 goals, one to reduce the waste and one to improve the consumption of, build student nutrition by improving fruit and vegetable uptake. And we actually reduced the waste of fruit and vegetables by almost 60% in some cases. So we were able to take that reduction and turn it into a dollar value based on the retail value of the food. So we definitely know that they were saving money. We don't necessarily advocate it. The school doesn't need to transport anything. The share basket, everything that goes into that share basket can actually be reused by the kitchen again. So it doesn't need to go anywhere. A lot of the other interventions were just helping the students to know what is a meal, that they didn't need to take a fruit and a vegetable. They didn't have to take a milk every day. They only had to have 3 components on their tray. So there was a lot of misunderstanding about how much they needed to take at lunchtime. So that was a way that we were able to intervene. So there wasn't really, I don't think for any of our school programs, there wasn't any transporting. We did, if they had a compost, if they weren't composting on site at their school and they were having somebody take it away, well, that was a cost, but that cost is always less than the cost of the trash. So trash has a hauling fee and a tipping fee that you have to pay. And because compost has an end product, so somebody is actually in the end going to have a valuable product, that is going to cost you less than actually paying somebody to tip it into a landfill where they're going to have to store that food. So the only extra cost, or the use of food that can't be managed right on the school campus is if you're using the food scraps as compost, and that incremental cost is actually still less than the cost for trash. Does that answer that question?
Yes. Yeah. Very nice.
Okay.
Here's another question. Have you come across any instances where recycled foods are labeled appropriate for vegans or vegetarians?
Well, let's see. Recycled food is really, when we talk about recycled food, we're really talking about composting, basically. When we're talking about something further up, we don't talk about it as recycling. We call it upcycling, because it's good edible food that has been human grade, and now you're making some things like apples to applesauce, or like leftover bread to breadcrumbs. So that is what we would call upcycling versus recycling, which is, it's not going to be edible anymore, but it still has a valuable use as compost. So that's the first part to address that question. So now if you want to say, are there upcycled foods that are vegan? I think that's something you could look at, but even upcycling itself is pretty new. And I think in many cases, the upcycling producers take in a bunch of that type of byproduct from different sources. So I think it might be harder, unless it is just, purely like it's an applesauce. So there's not going to, it was, good for, what was a vegan product and still should be. There should be nothing that happened in it. So, so I would say, yeah, I mean, if it's inherently a vegan type of product, then I would say as an upcycled product, it should probably have that same labeling. But you could, I'm sure, Google upcycled vegan products and see if there's anything that you could find.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? They can go in the chat. I don't see any. We give everyone just a moment or so.
Yeah, I hope that it was, I'd be interested in any feedback. It could be questions, but
Sure.
Also this is sort of a new presentation that I did just for this group, because I just thought you're a different kind of audience that, is really more involved with like the gardens and the compost and things like that. So I wanted to just point out how, it's really a really very simple thing to think about food this way and not waste it. So I hope Excellent. It resonated with your group, and any feedback and certainly any follow-up. If you come up with a question later on after today, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to try to help.
I will. And thank you very much, Susanne. It's a wonderful presentation.
Okay. Well,
thanks to everybody who joined us, and we will see you next week.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for joining this Tuesday talk. For more information, please visit Mary Spring at www.maryspring.org and also on our